Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a place for paying customers, not loiterers. The words, slick with a condescending courtesy that was worse than any outright insult, sliced through the Sunday morning chatter of the Oak Valley Diner. The crowd, a mix of after-church families and weekend regulars, didn't laugh, but a ripple of uncomfortable silence spread from the source, a kind of social shrapnel. A few people looked down at their plates, suddenly fascinated by their scrambled eggs. Others glanced over, their curiosity piqued. At the center of it all, a woman sat alone in a booth, her posture still, her hands resting on the worn head of a simple wooden cane. She did not react. She did not flinch. Her gaze remained fixed on the glass door at the front of the diner, her expression as placid and unreadable as a deep, calm lake. She was waiting. That was all. Officer Davies, young, with a jaw that seemed permanently clenched in a state of self-importance and a uniform that was still stiff with newness, adjusted his duty belt. The creak of leather was the only sound in the small bubble of tension he had created. He saw a woman in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, dressed in clothes that were clean but dated, a faded gray sweater over a simple pair of slacks. He saw the network of fine lines around her eyes, the silver streaks in her brown hair pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense bun. He saw the cane, and his mind, a blunt instrument of assumption, filed it away under frailty, indigence, problem. He saw everything but the truth. But across the street, unseen, a different kind of authority was observing. A man whose own uniform was softened by decades of service, whose eyes had learned to read the stories etched not in files, but in the stance of a person. Police Chief Miller, on his way to grab a coffee, paused. He saw the two officers talking to the woman. He saw the younger one's aggressive posture. And then he saw her stance. Even sitting, it was there. A stillness not of passivity, but of immense coiled control. A spine held straight not by effort, but by ingrained discipline. It was a posture he hadn't seen in 20 years, not since a dusty, blood-soaked street a world away. And a cold dread, mingled with a profound and sudden respect, began to bloom in his chest. Back in the diner, Davies leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss meant to be heard by the surrounding tables. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here. Just move along. If you believe that true strength is measured not in the noise you make, but in the respect you command in your silence, type honor below." The woman, Sarah Morgan, finally shifted her gaze from the door to the officer. Her eyes were the color of faded denim, and they held no fear, no anger, no indignation. They held only a quiet, unnerving patience. "I'm waiting for my daughter," she said. Her voice was low, raspier than he expected, the sound of disuse, perhaps, or of a life that had demanded more shouting than she had ever wished to do. The simplicity of her answer seemed to infuriate Davies more than any argument could have. It was a denial of his narrative, a refusal to play the part he had assigned her. "Right, your daughter," he sneered, drawing the words out. He glanced at his partner, Officer Kent, a man a decade his senior with weary eyes that signaled a deep desire to be anywhere else. Kent gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent plea for de-escalation. But Davies was on a roll, puffed up by the captive audience and his own rigid sense of order. "And I suppose she's a real important person, is she? The mayor, maybe, coming to rescue you." He gestured around the diner with a sweep of his hand. "These are good people, ma'am. Families. They come here for a peaceful meal. They don't need to be bothered by your situation." The word situation was a masterpiece of cowardly insinuation. It painted a picture of homelessness, of mental instability, of a life gone wrong, all without saying a single actionable word. Sarah's focus drifted back to the door, her attention on him dissolving as if he were nothing more than a buzzing fly. This absolute dismissal, this profound lack of engagement with his authority, was the final straw. His face hardened, the mask of professional courtesy falling away to reveal the petty tyrant beneath. "That's it. I've asked you nicely. You're trespassing. Now, you can get up and walk out of here on your own 2 feet, or I can help you." He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm, just above the elbow. The fabric of her old sweater was soft, but his grip was hard, a clear violation of the space she had so quietly occupied. It was a moment of pure, ugly dominance, the strong preying on the perceived weak, a public humiliation enacted under the fluorescent lights of a small-town diner. The air grew thick with unspoken protest. A man in a nearby booth started to rise, his face flushed with anger. The waitress, a teenager named Chloe, froze mid-step, a pot of coffee growing heavy in her hand. A low murmur rippled through the room, a collective intake of breath. Sarah Morgan did not resist. She did not pull away. She simply sat there, a statue of stoicism, her body held in a state of perfect, disciplined calm as the officer's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening. She was a boulder in a stream, and his arrogance was the water, flowing around her, unable to move her, unable to change her. She was waiting, and the world was about to find out who she was waiting for. The little bell above the diner door didn't so much chime as it was choked into silence. The cheerful jingle was abruptly cut off as the door swung open and stayed open, held by a figure that blocked the bright morning sun, casting a long, sharp-edged shadow across the checkered linoleum floor. The shadow fell over Officer Davies, over the table, over Sarah Morgan. For a half-second, no one moved. Then a second figure filled the doorway, then a third, and a fourth. They didn't rush in. They entered with a chilling, synchronized deliberation, a fluid and practiced economy of motion that spoke of thousands of hours of drill. They were ghosts in broad daylight, apparitions of discipline. 7 of them in total. 7 United States Marines in their dress blue uniforms. The deep blue of the jackets a stark contrast to the bright red trim. The white covers perched atop their heads at a perfect, uniform angle. Their black shoes gleamed with a mirror-like polish, each step they took on the diner floor making a soft, unified sound. They fanned out, not in a tactical, aggressive formation, but in something far more unnerving. It was a soft encirclement, a closing of a circle of presence. One took a position by the door. 2 flanked the end of the aisle. 2 more moved to the side, near the jukebox, their bodies creating a living wall. They did not speak. They did not look at the other patrons. Their collective gaze, a laser of focused intent, settled on the tableau at the booth, on Officer Davies, on his hand gripping the arm of the quiet woman. The diner, which had been simmering with a low murmur, fell into a profound, deafening silence. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator unit and the frantic, sudden thumping of Officer Davies's own heart in his ears. He was a man who operated on visual cues, on predictable patterns of behavior. This was a pattern he had no file for. This was an equation he could not solve. His world of loud commands and easy assumptions had just been invaded by an army of silence. He felt the eyes of the entire diner on him. But more than that, he felt the weight of the 14 eyes of the Marines, a pressure that was physical, immense, and utterly crushing. His grip on Sarah's arm, which a moment before had been a symbol of his power, now felt like a shackle, binding him to a terrible, unfolding mistake. At the head of the formation, a Marine stepped forward, breaking from the line. The chevrons on her sleeve were stark and clear. 3 stripes up, 2 rockers down, a bursting bomb in the center. A gunnery sergeant. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her back ramrod straight, her chin held high. Her eyes, a piercing, intelligent blue, were locked on Officer Davies's hand. She stopped about 5 feet from the booth, her polished shoes precisely aligned. The name on her uniform jacket read Rostova. She was young, perhaps not even 30, but she carried an aura of authority that felt ancient and absolute. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It was pitched low, a calm, controlled instrument of command that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "Officer!" The word was a flat, hard stone dropped into a still pond. Davies's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no room for negotiation in her expression, no hint of deference. He saw only purpose. "You have 3 seconds to remove your hand from my mother, the words detonated in the quiet room. My mother. The two words reconfigured the entire universe of the Oak Valley Diner. They were a flashbang of context, a revelation that shattered every assumption Davies had so confidently built. The woman in the faded sweater, the silent, the object of his public scorn, was the mother of this formidable warrior. The collective gasp of the patrons was audible this time. Davies's face went from ruddy confidence to a blotchy, pale shock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The connection between his brain and his mouth seemed to have been severed. His hand, as if acting on its own panicked instinct, flew back from Sarah's arm like he had touched a live wire. He stumbled back a step, bumping into a table, the clatter of a salt shaker sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova's eyes did not waver. They followed his retreating form, pinning him in place. She then shifted her gaze just slightly to her mother. The hardness in her expression softened by a fraction, a micro-expression of concern that was visible only to someone who knew her face intimately. "Mom," she said, her voice dropping another level, now filled with a quiet, familial warmth. "Are you all right?" Sarah Morgan simply nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. It was all the confirmation her daughter needed. Having assured herself of her mother's well-being, Rostova's attention snapped back to the two officers, her face once again an impassive mask of military discipline. She took another precise step forward. "Your name and badge number," she stated. It was not a request. It was an order. Officer Davies fumbled for words, his mind racing, trying to catch up to the catastrophic collapse of his authority. "Now, hold on a minute," he stammered, his voice an octave higher than usual. This woman she refused to. I had reason to believe. His justifications trailed off into a pathetic mumble as he looked into the unblinking eyes of the gunnery sergeant. He saw a wall of sheer, unadulterated competence, and he knew, with a sinking certainty that filled his stomach with ice, that every word he spoke was digging his professional grave deeper. It was at that moment that the diner door opened again, this time with a sense of weary urgency. Police Chief Miller stepped inside, his eyes immediately taking in the scene. He saw the 7 Marines in their immaculate dress blues, standing like statues of judgment. He saw Gunnery Sergeant Rostova, the very picture of a Marine NCO, confronting his officer. He saw the pale, terrified face of Officer Davies. And he saw the woman in the booth, Sarah Morgan, looking at him with those same quiet, patient eyes. The dread in his chest solidified. He had been too late. What in God's name is going on here? Miller's voice was a low growl, the sound of a man who had seen too much and had no patience left for foolishness. Officer Kent, Davies' partner, stepped forward, his expression one of profound relief at the chief's arrival. "Chief, we were just asking the lady to leave. She was—" Kent began, but Miller raised a hand, silencing him. He didn't need the garbled explanation. He could read the entire story in the body language, in the silent accusation of the Marines, in the shattered arrogance of Davies. Miller walked slowly past the line of silent Marines, his gaze lingering for a moment on Rostova's chevrons. He gave a slight, respectful nod, a gesture between professionals, before stopping beside the booth. He ignored Davies completely. He looked down at the woman with the cane. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now gentle, respectful. "Is your name Sarah Morgan?" Sarah looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her own eyes. She nodded. Yes, it was the first word she had spoken since her daughter's arrival. Miller let out a long, slow breath, a sound of deep regret. He turned, not just to his officers, but to the entire diner. He was no longer just a police chief. He was a witness, a historian, a man tasked with setting a terrible wrong right. His voice filled the room, imbued with a weight of authority that Davies could only ever dream of. "Officer Davies," he began, his tone dangerously calm. "You saw a woman with a cane, and you assumed she was a nuisance." Miller's gaze swept over the stunned faces of the patrons, then settled back on his disgraced officer. "Let me tell you who you just assaulted." He paused, letting the weight of the word assaulted hang in the air, a guillotine blade over Davies's career. This is Sergeant Major Sarah Morgan. Retired, the rank landed with the force of a physical blow. Sergeant Major, the highest enlisted rank, a name synonymous with leadership, with decades of service, with the absolute bedrock of the armed forces. A murmur went through the Marines. Their posture, already perfect, somehow became even more rigid, more reverent. Rostova's eyes widened slightly. She had known her mother was a legend, but to hear the rank spoken aloud, here, now, was something else entirely. She didn't serve behind a desk, Miller continued, his voice rising with a controlled, righteous anger. She was 3rd Force Reconnaissance. Special Operations, he let that sink in. Force Recon, the tip of the spear, the elite of the elite within the Marine Corps. The limp you found so suspicious, Davies? The reason she carries that cane? She earned it on her 3rd tour in Iraq. In Fallujah, she got it pulling 2 critically wounded Marines out of a building that had been hit by an RPG, all while under sustained sniper and machine gun fire. She shielded them with her own body until the case vac arrived. He took a step closer to Davies, his voice dropping to a low, personal, and devastating whisper. She refused a medal for it, said she was just doing her job. She just wanted to know if the boys she saved made it. They did. And I know that for a fact, officer, because one of those boys was my son. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave, sucking the last bit of air out of the diner. Davies's face crumpled, the last vestiges of his bravado dissolving into pure, unadulterated horror. He looked at Sarah Morgan, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a frail old woman, but a giant, a quiet, unassuming titan whose shoes he was not worthy to shine. Then came the ultimate gesture of validation. Chief Miller, a man who commanded a department of hundreds, a pillar of the community, slowly and deliberately removed his peaked police cap. He held it over his heart. Facing Sergeant Major Sarah Morgan, he brought his hand up in a slow, perfect military salute, a gesture of profound and absolute respect. As one, with a single, explosive sound of leather, fabric, and flesh, Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova and the 6 Marines of her squad snapped to attention, their right hands flashing to the brims of their white covers. 7 salutes, held with unwavering precision, for the quiet woman in the booth. The mother, the warrior, the sergeant major. The story of what happened in the Oak Valley Diner did not spread, it detonated. It moved with the speed of gossip supercharged by injustice and vindication. Before Sergeant Major Morgan had even finished her now complimentary coffee, brought by a teary-eyed waitress who refused to take a single dollar, the narrative was already taking root. The families who had witnessed it told their neighbors. The man who had started to stand up for her called his brother, who worked at the town newspaper. The diner owner, a man named Gus who had seen a lot in his 40 years behind the counter, called the local VFW post commander himself. By noon, the story was the primary topic of conversation at the police precinct, whispered in hallways and break rooms, a cautionary tale about the chasm between perception and reality. Officer Davies was placed on immediate administrative leave, a sterile term for a deeply personal disgrace. The tale reached the gates of the nearby Marine base like a returning war hero. It crackled over text messages between platoons, shared in mess halls and barracks common areas. A gunnery sergeant's mother, a retired sergeant major from Force Recon, disrespected by a rookie cop and then backed by her daughter's squad in full dress blues? It was the stuff of instant legend, a modern military folktale that reinforced every core value they held dear: honor, loyalty, and the sacred respect owed to those who had gone before. The story wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about the details. The perfect, synchronized silence of the Marines. The chief of police's personal connection. The final, thundering salute. Every element was burnished and polished with each retelling, acquiring a mythic quality. It became a lesson, an institutional parable about the dangers of assumption and the quiet strength that resides in the unassuming. The transformation of Officer Davies began not with a suspension, but with a summons. Chief Miller didn't fire him. That would have been too easy, a simple removal of the problem. Miller believed in restorative justice, in the painful, grinding process of learning a lesson so thoroughly it becomes part of your DNA. Davies was ordered to report in civilian clothes to the local Veterans Outreach Center every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 3 months. His job was not to talk, but to listen, to make coffee, to clean the floors, and to sit in on the support groups, hearing the stories of the men and women he had been trained to see only as statistics or potential problems. He sat there, his face pale and drawn, as a Vietnam vet described the Tet Offensive, his hands shaking. He listened as a young woman, not much older than him, talked about the IED that took her leg in Afghanistan. He heard stories of triumph, of loss, of the quiet, grinding struggle to reintegrate into a world that had no frame of reference for what they had seen and done. The arrogance was sandblasted away from him, layer by painful layer, replaced by a raw, humbling empathy. The culmination of his penance was a formal, handwritten letter of apology. Chief Miller made him write it out 3 times until the wording was stripped of any self-serving justification and contained only pure, unvarnished remorse. He was then ordered to deliver it in person. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, a week after the incident, a nervous, profoundly changed young man in a rumpled collared shirt knocked on the door of a small, tidy house on the edge of town. Sarah Morgan answered the door herself. She was not wearing a faded sweater, but a simple house dress, and she held a gardening trowel in one hand, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She took the letter from his trembling hand and read it right there on the doorstep, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. When she finished, she folded it neatly and looked at him. Davies braced for a lecture, for a tirade, for the anger he so richly deserved. Instead, the sergeant major simply said, "Thank you, son. We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them. Would you like a glass of water?" He was so stunned he could only shake his head and mumble his thanks before retreating to his car, his eyes burning with tears of shame and a strange, unexpected gratitude. Sarah Morgan, for her part, wanted no part of the legend. She deflected the praise, waved off the offers of free meals, and treated the new, reverent nods from strangers with a simple, polite smile. She was a mother, a gardener, a retiree. The sergeant major was a ghost from another life. But the world had been reminded of that ghost's existence, and it would not soon forget. The next Sunday, she was back at her usual table in the Oak Valley Diner, waiting for her daughter. This time, the coffee was already there when she arrived, hot and fresh. Gus, the owner, had quietly installed a small, brass plaque on the wall above the booth. It was discreet, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. It read, "Reserved for quiet professionals." It was a small artifact, a quiet testament to a loud lesson, a permanent marker of the day when a circle of silent, blue-clad warriors reminded an entire town that the deepest rivers of honor often run the most silently. A year passed, the seasons turned, and the legend of the diner Encirclement, as it came to be known, settled from a wildfire into the warm, enduring embers of institutional folklore. At the police academy, new cadets were no longer just shown slide presentations on community relations. They were sat down in a classroom and told a story by a guest speaker they didn't expect. The speaker was Officer Davies. He stood before them, no longer the cocky, arrogant rookie, but a man seasoned by a profound and public humiliation. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. He used no notes. He simply told them what he had done, what he had assumed, and the price of his ignorance. "I saw a uniform," he would tell the wide-eyed recruits, his voice steady. "My uniform, and I thought it gave me all the authority I needed. I saw an old woman with a cane, and I saw a problem to be solved. I didn't see a hero. I didn't see a sergeant major. I didn't see a mother. My failure was not a failure of training. It was a failure of respect." He would then detail his re-education, his time at the Veterans Center, the stories he heard, the faces he could never forget. He became the Academy's most effective instructor on the subject of implicit bias, his own shame repurposed into a powerful shield for future generations of officers. His story was a vaccination against the very arrogance that had almost destroyed him. The legacy of that day was not one of punishment, but of positive, lasting change. Chief Miller and Gunnery Sergeant Rostova, prompted by the incident, established a joint liaison program between the police department and the Marine base. It was a simple initiative. Once a month, a handful of officers and a handful of NCOs would have breakfast together. Not in a formal meeting, but at the Oak Valley Diner. They would sit at different tables, mix, and just talk. They learned each other's language, each other's challenges, each other's humanity. The walls of assumption and mistrust that had existed between the town and the base began to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding built over coffee and scrambled eggs. The small brass plaque above Sarah Morgan's booth became a point of quiet pride for the town. Newcomers would ask about it, and Gus or one of the waitresses would tell the story, their voices filled with a certain reverence. It was their story now, a piece of local history that defined the character of their community. It taught them that heroes didn't always wear capes or even uniforms. Sometimes they wore faded sweaters and carried the weight of their service in a quiet limp. The most profound legacy, however, was the quietest one. It was in the unwavering bond between a mother and her daughter. Every Sunday, Gunnery Sergeant Eva Rostova, often accompanied by one or two of the young Marines from her squad, would walk into the Oak Valley Diner and slide into the booth across from her mother. The young Marines, these 19-year-old kids who could face down enemy fire without flinching, were utterly terrified and in complete awe of the quiet woman with the kind eyes. They called her ma'am or sergeant major, their voices cracking with respect. She would just smile, ask them about their families, and listen to their stories, just as she had listened to the stories of countless young warriors over a 30-year career. She was still their sergeant major, not by rank, but by her very presence. She was the living embodiment of their highest ideals, a quiet, steady lighthouse in the chaotic seas of their young lives. True strength isn't measured by the volume of your voice, but by the conviction of your silence. It isn't found in a uniform or a badge you wear for a shift, but in the scars you carry for a lifetime and the lives you've touched along the way. Legacy is not a statue in a park or a name carved in granite. It's a lesson learned by a humbled officer, a story told in a quiet diner that builds a bridge between two worlds, and the unwavering loyalty of a daughter's Marine squad, who know, with absolute certainty, that the most formidable warriors are often the ones you would never notice at all. They are the quiet professionals, and their silence is the sound of true honor. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent sacrifice defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.